welcome to Art of Practice. I'm Lisa Frost, and with me is Kevin Snorf. And this is our inaugural podcast. We're going to be diving into some topics around practice and coming at it from a variety of ways, I would say. But today we're going to kind of do a little intro into how we both hold practice and a few other things. So welcome. And if you are joining us for the replay, welcome. We're excited to be bringing this to you. Yeah, Kevin, what do you want to say?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this. Thanks for suggesting this. Thanks for taking the lead on this. Lisa and I go way back to we went through the Integral Coaching Canada program together and became certified coaches together way back. And about 2 years ago, reconnected and started talking about not only like how we hold practice, but what our edges are. How can we be of mutual support to each other and other people? And certainly a big part of the integral endeavor is trying to think about how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others in more skillful ways. And so we've just been kind of having a nice ongoing dialogue about that, where we're discovering new topics, discovering new practices, discovering ways of relating to each other differently. And in that ongoing conversation that's just evolved, Lisa's like, I feel like there's just a lot of value in but it's just us talking. Like, maybe we should open that up to others. And do you want to do this art of practice thing with me, since we're both deep in practice? And I was like, why not? I'm an Enneagram 9. I'm like, sure, let's do that. So that kicked off, and it's actually kind of exciting for me because it's something that's near and dear to who I am and what I think the world needs. And so there's a lot of crossover there. So yeah, it's we'll see where this goes. Like, we really are holding an attitude here of trying to just have a nice conversation between us that we hope other people value, but we want it to really be iterative and see what happens. So we're hoping you'll enjoy the ride with us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just to let you know, Kevin, we just are streaming now to YouTube.
I see that.
So
yeah,
if you're just signing in and watching us on YouTube, hello, my name is Lisa Frost, and this is Kevin Snorf, and we are your hosts today for the Art of Practice. So yeah, so Kevin, we've been doing this for about 2 years, and I do think that there's a variety of things that we actually end up in conversation about that probably would be valuable to others. But what I'd love to just start with is to kind of ground us in, I guess, in how we each hold practice. Like, what I mean, let's start at the beginning of the story. Right? What do we mean by practice, and what does it personally mean to each of us? And I'd love for you to take a stab at that one.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because it's like, for those who don't know who we are or know us, I would have a hard time introducing myself to someone who doesn't know my background without talking about practice. It's kind of a funny thing for me to. I often will lead when people ask me, what about you? What do you do? It's like, it's not so much what I do professionally. It's like how I try to cultivate myself. It's how I think of myself, and that often has to do with the kind of practices I'm involved in. So, but yeah, it's interesting. So I think most people are walking through the world in a very reactive place, and they're just sort of going through the motions that life asks of them. This calamity happens over here. This seemingly random success story happens over on this side of things. And they're just kind of like surprised, and, like it's not conscious. It's very reactive. And so, like, the idea of living a conscious life, to live a life that's awake, that has a sense of clarity or vision behind it, or like, what do you want to become? Immediately, like we all are, then it's like, well, how do we do that? And you can't do that without practice. And so if any of us have any sense in ourselves of like, I want to have a life that I enjoy, that's deliberate, that's purposeful, that's, enjoyable, I don't see how you like get there without some kind of practice. And I'm holding this idea of practice very loosely. A lot of people think of practice as like working out or doing meditation or something like that. And I think that those are totally helpful. But I'm holding practice in a much, much larger container of like, how do we live our lives consciously and deliberately so that we're moving in the direction we want to be going versus following this little tangent or that little tangent reactively.
Yeah. I love that you actually pointed to it being something deliberate, because I think that, the way that I think of it is we're always practicing something, right?
Yeah.
And either we're doing it consciously or we're doing it unconsciously. And either we are practicing how to continue being and showing up the way that we are already showing up, or we're practicing something that is potentially a little different. We're practicing something that is more aligned with our truth, more aligned with our authentic nature, more aligned with our values, who we want to be, like how we want to show up in the world. And yeah, it's like, I don't know, I feel very strongly that that life sort of is like being alive is the practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then within that sort of meta practice, you have the ways in which you might be deciding to create practice for yourself, to enact something that may be different than what you've enacted in the past.
Yeah. One of the things I often talk about with my students is this sense of, if you want to be good at being some kind of athlete, there are practices that you do to do that, like you sit there and you swing the bat, or you swing the golf club, or you swing you swing your fists in my case. And if you want to be good at playing piano, you got to sit there and you got to play the scales, and you got to learn all those pieces. If you want to get good at leadership, there's whole curriculums of how to practice being good at leadership. And so if you want to get good at life, if you want to have a more conscious, enjoyable life, why do we somehow have this idea that we should be precluded from some kind of practice? And I think part of that has to do with, like a story that we tell ourselves, like, you mean effort is required for my life to get better?
Yeah.
Oh crap, that seems too hard. And for a lot of people it is, they might have other stuff going on. It might not be the right time for practice. There might not be enough emotional bandwidth to attend to a kind of conscious practice. There's all kinds of things that can come up that can take us away from practice, which I think is a really interesting subject. We should probably do a whole thing on, resistance to practice. But just bringing it back to the point, that I'm always trying to solidify is like, no matter what you want to become, there's almost always a practice for it, and your engagement in that is almost necessary to being able to get towards a place of mastery or excelling or just even betterment at what you're doing. Well, there's a line from Ken Wilber, who, if you're involved in integral life, you should probably know. It's something you're going to have to help me with this if I forget it. It's enlightenment is an accident and meditation makes you accident prone, and I think like being good and having mastery at life is an accident. and the people who've done that, if you look really carefully, have really put the time in to do their reps and make themselves accident prone, because they've had some kind of deliberate practice that they've been engaged in that's deep. And so then that just starts to beg the question of, for me, early on in my life, what do I want to become and how do I practice to get there? That's pretty much what I think every morning.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something else that we talk about in these integral circles, and that is that the map is not the territory. And one of the things that occurs to me is, as I was listening to you, is that that practice is not the purpose.
Yeah.
That practice is what we do to be, as you say, accident prone, right? It's the thing that we do to actually be able to show up the way that we want to show up in the moments where it matters. A pianist does not practice scales because they want to be good at scales. They practice scales because that's part of what you do in order to be good at playing the piano, which is the purpose, right?
Yeah.
And so I hold practice, any kind of practice that we're talking about in exactly the same light. It's like, I may identify as a meditator, or I may identify as someone who does yoga, or I may identify as someone who practices surrender, but the practice itself is not the point. The practice is what we do so that when I'm in an argument with my wife, that I can drop into a more surrendered state and actually hear what she's saying, rather than a reactive state. And so the practice itself, the practice of surrender in that particular instance, is really about being able to show up in those moments that matter. Right?
Yeah. Luckily for me, I'm so practiced at marriage that I don't have that problem of getting into arguments with my wife at all. But my joke aside, like, I think that's the point here, which is, practice doesn't guarantee any kind of result. It just guarantees a certain kind of fluency over time that ideally in the right moment can be channeled towards what you want to become, or what you want to be great at, or what you want to be endeavoring towards mastery with, and I kind of am feeling like we need to talk about the mastery with part of, what we mean by integral, like practice and that sort of stuff too, and getting into that here. But there's one other thing I was going to say, and I think I lost it. Maybe it'll come back. Well, actually, I just want to be a human highlighter for something that you said earlier, which is often not conscious for people, is this sense of, you can also look at your existent life, if you're not in practice, or in times that you're not in practice, as participating in a kind of practice. Like, whatever you do more of, you're more likely to continue to do, and you're developing a certain kind of fluency at. And so if you're reacting to in an argument with your wife most of the time, and you don't have a conscious practice to back that up, then you're actually strengthening that muscle of getting into arguments. If you're checking your phone every time a notification clicks on you, it's not just a dopamine loop that you're putting yourself in. It's you're committing to a practice of being enslaved to those notifications, rather than how you consciously want to be using your time. And so that it's useful, I think, for people to actually back off a little bit, and instead of saying, oh, I really need to practice more consciously, given what Kevin and Lisa are saying, it's to say, well, what's the table stakes right now? Like, I'm already in a certain kind of practice that may not be conscious, it may be reactive, but by naming that, that's also, for those of you who know the subject object move, it's helping you become more aware of the what is that is not conscious and potentially needs to shift, and can be a great let's say motivator helping you want to create conscious practice. So yeah. that feels like a super important point. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That actually, I think, leads us into quite nicely what do you think makes a good practice? Like, what are the components of a good practice?
Well, let's start with the obvious. It's deliberate, it's something you want to be participating in and growing yourself. I've often seen people go down rabbit holes of practice because someone told them they should, but they hate it. It's not moving them where they want to grow. And it's like, well, that's great. But it's like, if that's not if it doesn't light you up, if it doesn't make you a better person, if it's not in the direction of what you feel your life is about, then you're doing a practice for someone else other than yourself. So actually starting with a little bit of selfish quality but selfish in the sense of who's the bigger me that I want to be, that I want to become, that actually is bigger than my lesser egoic drives, so it's starting with why, I would say, is a really, really important place to start. There's more to add, but what would be your piece on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that starting with something that is beginning with the story of who am I, or what am I interested in working on in myself.
Yeah.
What am I seeing already that isn't really how I want to show up, or isn't really how I want to continue operating in the world. Where am I struggling? What are the major challenges that I'm having over and over and over again? And what would it take for me to build some muscles around that would allow me to show up differently, more aligned with how I want to be, more aligned with how I want to operate, more aligned with what feels true to me. So I love this idea of starting with the why, because there has to be something, right? There has to be something that is real for you, that is driving the desire to practice. And it can look like a lot of different things. Like, it can look like an actual struggle.
Yeah.
It can also look like, gosh, I'm realizing that I feel like I'm not doing well with, sort of how chaotic the world has become. And I don't know how to get, like, my focus has suffered, and I don't know how to get my focus back. Like, it doesn't have to be a specific thing like I named earlier, around, maybe interpersonal communication or whatever, but it can be sort of a general feeling of, yeah, I just don't feel like I am doing as well as I'd like to be doing. I don't have as much access to peace as I'd like to have, right? And so there's ways that I think that all of us we already know sort of where these things are popping up in our lives. And so starting with that and beginning to look at, what is the new the new action I want to take in those moments? What is the new way that I want to show up? What is that new doing? We had talked about this, and I want to actually preface this, because this is where we're starting to get into, I think, something that I'd like to name, and you did earlier, but I want to make it explicit, and that is that we come from a very specific background on how to construct practice, being integral master coaches. And so that's a large part of how what we had to develop as we became coaches. But yes, so I love this idea of, what is the new doing that I want to enact? What is the new way of seeing that I want to want to start using? What is the new way of for results that I want to enact? And those are sort of the three components from the ICC methodology that construct a good practice, right? A new doing, a new seeing, and a new way of checking.
Yeah, and shameless plug here for Integral Coaching Canada as having like one of the most incredible applications and methodologies surrounding AQUAL and integral that I think you and I have ever seen, but also in terms of just really blowing our minds around what counts as practice and how to think about practice differently and how to create practice designs that are super creative and customized and very different and off the cuff than a lot of us are used to thinking about practice. And so big props to them for all the work they put into how creating some of those distinctions that you just named of new doing and new seeing, and having a chance to really reflect on through reflection questions. And another part of this too, and this is also what's great about an integral perspective is like, you'll often see people who have an approach to practice, and this happens in coaching and it happens in therapy and it helps in other like mentoring situations, where if we just talk or if we just get insights looking at Instagram or whatever it is, and all I have is the new seeing, that somehow that's enough. And for some people it is actually. Some people get the new idea and they can take the ball and run with it. Most people not, but there is sort of this indoctrination that happens around like if I just get the new idea and the new mind snack, and I get to chew on something yummy upstairs, then that's enough to create change. In my experience, and in an integral approach, not. You also have, like before I got into coaching, I was very practice-based, but I didn't care about the beliefs and the seeing and the deeper understanding of what was going on upstream in people's consciousness. I was just like, do the practice. The practice changes you. And it's all about the new doing. Who cares about the new seeing? And I got a rude wake-up call going into Integral Coaching Canada that's not really effective, and it creates a lot of resistance. And it might work for people like me who are just extremely driven and hard on themselves, but it really doesn't work for the majority of the people. That you need both. And so when people are thinking about practice for themselves and also offering practices to other people, it's worth identifying, do I have a particular bias towards the doing or the seeing or the reflecting, such that I'm not getting an integrated weave of seeing how the three of them fit together in such a way that makes a practice really effective. Just doing the doing without the seeing really actually limits the sustainability. Just having the seeing without the doing really limits the embodiment of, you always have to remember it, in order to make it happen, versus if you add the doing, then the cellular level of who you are gets it, and it becomes more automatic and you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And, so I've often talked about this in the terms of insight and embodiment, right? So it's like, yeah, that insight is super cool. And I'm a little bit of an insight junkie.
Yeah.
I'll be honest.
A lot of us are. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny because in recent, in recent years, there's so much to be said about mindset shifts. Right. And this isn't to discount that that's a real thing, and that it can actually lead to some profound new ways of thinking. And yet, if you're not using those new ways of thinking in your actual life and doing something with them, then it's like you constantly have to reference back to this new concept, and you don't just get it at that cellular level or at that subconscious level. It doesn't become the way that you operate in the world. And so the embodiment piece is super duper important. So yeah, I think that, I'm going to guess that the people listening are probably really on board with the whole new doing and new seeing. Let's talk about this thing called reflection. Let's talk about the way of checking. How do you see that as being the sort of the third leg of that stool?
So, you use the words way of checking, which is gets into a model we can talk about later that's really kind of cool. But having a seeing, having a doing, and having a checking is really helpful. And the checking is really looking at your standards. And one of the ways that I really came to understand change through the Integral Coaching Canada methodology is that our ways of checking our standards for how we hold ourselves is one of the last things to change, which kind of makes sense the more you think about it and the more you work with it. It's easy to get a new belief on Instagram. It's easy. It's not too hard to start a practice. It tends to be very hard to maintain and keep a new doing going. But if we're not, like, the longer you do a practice, if you're not reflecting about actually what's changing and how it's changing, both my beliefs and the way that I act and behave, if you're not bringing attention and awareness to that, if there's not reflection about that, then it's like you're not registering the change. You're not checking how much money is in the bank account, and is it all deposits or is it all withdrawals, and so as the practice goes on, the process of having inquiry that has you check places that you wouldn't normally habitually check is really, really helpful at calibrating the success of a practice and actually catalyzing it as well. What would you say, though?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that one of the things that come up, and when you talk about calibrating a practice, this is sort of where it lands for me. It's like checking to make sure that that you're growing.
Yeah.
Right? That the practice is actually having the effect that you're going for, and calibrating the practice, because even as we grow and change, it's like the same practices may still serve us if they have been if they've been growing and changing with us.
Yeah.
And so being able to reflect back on, yes, how am I growing? How am I changing? Is that the desired effect? Is there any calibration that needs to happen? And then there may be deeper layers of that same practice that we really want to explore and grow into. Yeah, so that's what occurs to me.
Let me put myself on the chopping block too. I remember going through Integral Coaching Canada's program, and of course you yourself are in different practices related to how you're growing as a coach. And a lot of my work was around emotional intelligence and relating differently to difficult emotions in people when they would come up. And having a background as someone who thought of themselves as kind of a tough guy in mixed martial arts and stuff, I don't know if we have a beep button on here, but you invited me on the podcast and I have the worst potty mouth ever. And so we really need that beep button. But I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Every practice was, how does this feel emotionally? And I'm like, and that's just not a place I would normally check. And yet it was good for me too. And it actually gave me a heart, thank God. and so that, but we habitually, like, I would check my mind and sometimes my body, but not the emotional domain. And so having reflection be geared towards, where else can I check that I'm not habitually checking? It adds a dexterity to the practice that opens new possibilities around how you're actually thinking of being in the practice. And I think that's critical. Another piece about that too that just comes up for me around, we're going back to like what makes a good practice. This kind of deals a little bit with masculine and feminine and checking different places. Like when I think of practice still to this day, despite everything that I've been through, like if the practice isn't challenging, like I'm like, it doesn't seem very fun, like, and that's my masculine disposition to always like challenge myself and grow through challenge. And so like, for example, when I would teach acrobatics and acro yoga, it was so cool to watch people come to class and be like, this is amazing. I want to do this every day. And what I noticed is that their desire to be in practices was more on the nurturing side. And so it's like, it lit them up. It gave them passion. Like it gave them something, it injected something into their life that they didn't have, which was fun, which was play, which was interconnection through acrobatic practice. And so another thing to think of when you're thinking of practice, and it comes up for me around ways of checking, is, am I in kind of a depleted place? Do I need a shot in the arm? Perhaps the wrong metaphor to use in this day and age. It's a little controversial, but do I need a shot in the arm that lifts me up emotionally and has more of the nurturing quality? Or is my life kind of static in a way in which challenge would actually give me a buzz and call me forth into something deeper? Or maybe I'm screwing up in some way in my marriage or in my job, and I need a challenge to go deeper. And so I think another thing to think about when people are thinking about what makes a good practice is, does it have the right blend of challenge and nurture for what I'm needing in my life right now?
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, in some ways, so not a single practice may have that balance, and that's okay.
Exactly.
It may be that there's, a few practices that you're participating in that actually could serve different purposes for that. Yeah. I think that actually nicely leads also into this thing called scale, structure, and specificity. As you start to think about, what makes a good practice. What do you want to say about that?
Let's start with scale. You can't run a marathon if you can't run around the block. So having accurate expectations and scaling practices is so important. Like, if somebody's like, I really need to learn to meditate, and I'll say, like, well, what does that look like for you? It means sitting down for an hour every day in quiet and just having my mind be totally empty. And I'm like, well, I've been doing that for 20 years and my mind is never empty and it's still not fun. So like, why don't we start with, on your elevator ride up to the 50th floor, you don't look at your phone. You just stop and you take as many breaths as it takes to get to the 50th floor with your eyes closed. And you do what you need to ground yourself before you walk into the chaos that is work.
Yeah.
Let's start with that. It takes 30 seconds to a minute, And then now it's like, that's an on-ramp that almost anybody can get behind. And it sets a realistic expectation that sets people up for success versus, I'm not meditating an hour a day, I'm a failure. You're never going to meditate if that's the internal dialogue, right? So scale, I think, is probably one of the biggest obstacles. Do you want to say anything about scale from your standpoint? And I can get into the others.
Yeah, it just, I love that you took meditation as the example, actually, because I think it's a great example. I think that there's probably a lot of us, me included, who have wanted to take on a meditation practice. And what does that actually mean? And for many people, it means, oh yeah, 15 minutes or more, right?
Yeah.
And the truth of it is that sitting for 15 minutes is actually a milestone.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a starting point. And sometimes people forget that. It's like it's okay to be a beginner in a practice.
Yeah.
And it's okay to set the bar at a beginner scale, so that you can be successful in that, and so you can build from it. Because actually what happens is that if we begin our practices at the right scale, we have far less resistance.
Yeah. Yep. And there are some types that like myself that like the intensity of a really, really extreme, challenging practice. But what I've noticed about those people and myself is those tend to be like one-off things, like, training for an extreme race course or something like that, or something. But it's not usually that. because the scale is so high, it's so hard to maintain that it doesn't have any longevity to it.
Right.
And so sometimes that's okay. Sometimes practice can be just a one-off, and that's cool.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I was able to do an extreme race and I never thought I could. Great. That you learned something about yourself. You have more capability than you give yourself credit for. Awesome. And then how do you take that back into an everyday life? It's like the people who go to amazing self-development workshop at Esalen over the weekend, and they're like, I'm going to change my whole, and then there's the Monday morning syndrome,
Right.
It's like, how do you actually iron out the smoothness of integrating what you've learned into an everyday life? So and that and a little bit of scale has to do with the other pieces you brought up of structure and specificity. Is like, whenever I talk about whenever I give clients practices, I'm like, okay, cool. Glad you like the practice. Glad you're committed to it. We'll talk about it in a couple of weeks and see how it goes. Now the hard part. Where's this going in your schedule, in your life? How do we plan for it? How do you put it in the calendar right now so that you know that's the time for you to engage in the practice? And sometimes that's what I would call outside of the hot zone. Like if they have a professional leadership topic, and I'm mostly doing leadership coaching, it's like, it might be doing nothing for 5 minutes before they leave the house and having a cup of tea, and so that's like outside of the hot zone. It doesn't have anything to do with their leadership skill in the moment. It has everything to do with how I'm showing up for myself before I step into the hot zone. And then there also might be a hot zone practice of speak up more than you're comfortable with in meetings for the next 3 weeks. But then it's like, that's not enough. What meetings? And what are the cues that you look for to know that you need to speak up? And what are the moments when you don't want to speak up in that meeting inside of the hot zone because I'm afraid it'll get me fired, or I'm afraid that people won't like me, or it'll draw flack, or it'll create more work for me. All these stories. It's like, how do we know when to speak up and not? And so getting into the nitty-gritty around practice and getting into the specificity of when it's happening, I find, is one of the things that really increases the chances of practice actually happening for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And, I remember one of the things that we talked about quite a lot at ICC, and I still use with my clients, is likening this to muscle building, right? It's like, if you want to increase if you want to increase the strength in your biceps, you do reps with your biceps. Yeah. It's very specific. Yeah. Right. And what that does is it allows you to build strong biceps. Yeah. It doesn't, it's not going to do anything for your legs. And that's not what we're concentrating on. We're actually concentrating on the biceps, because that's the place where you've already identified that's where the point of weakness is, or that's the point of, that's creating some issues or whatever. So I love that. I love that idea of, getting it down, drilling it down to a single muscle or a single capacity, a single competency, a single, a single action that you're doing. And then you're measuring your progress against that. And then, scaling that may look like, in the example that you gave, it could look like, oh, now I'm going to speak up in other kinds of meetings, or in other kinds of contexts, or it could be something entirely different, where it's still coming at that muscle, but coming at it in an entirely different way. Yeah. Nice. So I'm just cluing into the time, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for people to ask questions. But before we get to that, I was thinking that we might want to just talk about, how to, is there anything that you want to say about anybody who's listening to this that wants to design their own practice? Like, is there anything that you can give as a tip in designing their own practice?
Pick one, not 10.
Well, if you can roll them off, yeah, give me 10.
Oh no, I mean, that's my advice actually, is pick one, don't do 20. Don't this is not a free-for-all shopping spree, where you're trying to get as much in your cart as possible. It's build on consistency. Because another thing we haven't talked about that's really, I think, important is the practice of practice, which is like, if you don't have a lot of experience with practice, or you have an aversion to practice, or you have a little bit of practice, but adding more and listening to Lisa and I right now just sound like you're immediately getting a migraine. If any of that's happening for you, it's thinking of kind of meta, like there's a practice of attending to practice, and that needs scale too. And it's better to have one consistent practice that's hitting the mark for you across the board, and to do it for 6 months consistently to the point that you're bored with it, and then keep doing it and try and reinvigorate it, or try and keep it alive, and then add another practice that's also small and scaled, so that you're building up. But I think the first thing is just to identify either the biggest longing you have in your life, or realistically for most people, the biggest pain point, and to try and find a practice that could give you some capability, some muscle, potentially physical muscle, knowing, some of the brainiacs that exist inside of Integral Life. I mean, no disrespect, because I am a recovering brainiac myself, but it's that sense of building a muscle consistently for a while, getting the hang of it, being able to trust that it's there, and then trying something new versus jumping around or trying everything at once. Because when you focus on everything, you end up focusing on nothing.
Yeah, that actually brings up two things for me. The first is, we have this thing called integral life practice, and there's this tendency, I think, for integralists to think that they need to take on an entire integral life practice.
Totally.
That is like, attending to the 4 quadrants, to all the lines. That's
right.
Attending to this thing called wake up, grow up, show up, clean up. That's like attending to the whole thing. And I think that people have a tendency to set themselves up for failure from the very, very word start. In holding it this way. So I love that you pointed to start with one thing. The other thing that I love that you pointed to is something that Laura and Joanne taught at ICC, which is the first practice is building the body of someone who does the thing, right? And what I really have always appreciated about that is that we underestimate how much change actually occurs at the level of physiology first. And if we can get something new into our bodies, we likely can get it into the other parts of us, into the mind, into the heart. If we can start with the body first. And so if you're someone who doesn't have really any practice, starting with a somatic practice is a good way to begin. And, and one of the things, and I really do love the language of building a new body of. I think there's something very, I don't know, just juicy about that. And so I would think of it as, if there's a particular yearning, like you talked about, Kevin, or if there's a particular challenge or pain point, it's like, what would the body of someone who could actually handle that better? What would that body look like? Right? What would it feel like? And to start to find a practice that actually begins to build the body of that.
Absolutely. And I also think too, like, I think it's good to think about the pain point and a why that behind your practice, and how that would free you up if you're choosing a practice, or your next practice is to get really conscious about how you could free yourself up by attending to that and following it. I lost my point. This happens. Let me see if it comes back. Oh yeah, back to the body part. But it's also this sense then of knowing that what would also give me the biggest bang for my buck, like what's the low hanging fruit, and actually doing exercise of any kind and being in the body has just massive influence on psychology, emotions, sleep, relationships, like the whole, so for people who don't have a body practice, I'm always like, that's a good place to start in, and start with scale, and start with something that you want to enjoy, and start with something that has a tiny tinge of challenge to it that keeps you interested. And that tends to be my frame of reference, and perhaps a bias, having a background in martial arts, yoga, and all the acrobatics and all the body things. But so I want to name my bias, but I really do feel like that tends to be a biggie that a lot of people skip when it comes to an integral life practice, is like, oh yeah, this vehicle that's carrying me around constantly. I'm not just a brain on a stick.
Yeah, and I want to highlight, I would actually underscore what you just said. So what you were talking about is being in any kind of exercise and being in your body while you do it.
Yeah.
And what that means is not being in, because here I'm going to give you an example of what that doesn't mean.
Great.
Because I am like great at what it doesn't mean. So I wanted to take up running, and I had a horrible resistance to running, but I found a really magical way for me to be able to enact running. And the enacting of running happened when I listened to loud trance music, and also watched a documentary and had the captions on so I could read it. So if I had my mind radically occupied with something else, then my body could run. But then when I decided that I actually wanted to be embodied while I ran, that was a whole different animal. So having a practice where you can actually be in the body while you're doing it, being fully present with the body while you're doing it, regardless of what it is a practice in and of itself.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that it highlighted for me was that there's also a way of being in a body practice that can be an interesting way. And this is something that I have played with, and we've talked about actually. It's like, I enjoy walking the hills of my neighborhood. And so one of the practices that I like to utilize is called, what does it look like to come into that practice of walking the hills from a new way of being. And so if I have a couple of qualities that I am actually wanting to build in myself, what does it mean to walk hills as those qualities, and to start allowing my body to take the shape of those qualities, and allow those qualities to feed into how I am performing that particular practice of walking hills.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because that gets into like the seeing inside of the doing too, which is like, for me, it related to going back to an example that I gave earlier. It's like a lot of times when I work out, and I work out really hard, because our bodies and our muscles and all of our cellular aspects of who we are hold lots of emotions, sometimes stuff comes up, and my old pattern is push that down, just keep going, don't look at, and so actually I'll notice sometimes when I'm doing like really deep yoga that I'll just go to child's pose, and I'll cry for 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and who knows what's even being released or something like that. But I would have never had access to that if I didn't have a different way of seeing, other than just do the yoga, just make yourself stronger, just make yourself more flexible. Like, that's what we're doing here. And it's like, yoga's about union. Like union with your greatest potential, like not just source, but who you can be. And so to the extent that I'm denying a part of myself called emotions, I'm not in yoga. And so it's like, so how you're being way of being that you're bringing to practice is just as important as the new doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that we've talked about here quite a few times is ICC, and we've mentioned Laura and Joanne.
Yeah.
And for those of you who know, Laura Devine passed recently. And so those of us who come from ICC, and I'm sure her loved ones and everybody else who knew her, were all in a state of honoring her, and some well, I'll speak for myself, some sadness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is the art of practice. This is not the technique of practice. This is not and she was an artist at practice to the extent that, you know, a little birdie recently told me in relationship to this, and I loved her dearly, and I'm super sad that she's gone, and really been feeling it lately. But you know, also just beyond inspired that she was in her practice of meditation and Tai Chi right up to the very end. Wow. Which is like, how freaking inspiring is that? You know, like, talk about a life of practice. Like, you've been teaching everyone your whole life to live a life of practice. And then you lead by example, even though your cognition is mostly gone, and even though your body's incredibly deteriorated and you can barely do anything, like right up to the moment of death, you're just committed to practice in that way and alleviating suffering in yourself and others through it. And I think, like, to me, examples like that inspire me to always want to be in practice and to live a life of practice and to commit to greater and greater depths of practice, and to really feel the gravity that practice can have upon a person, that it can be a form of salvation right up to perhaps the scariest moment of life, of entering the great mystery, you know?
Yeah. 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 I want to pause here and just see if there's any questions or comments from anybody who's watching. And if not, then I do actually have another question that I want to ask you. So I don't see anything coming through. Do you on your side?
Nope. There's a comment over on YouTube around I think trying to hold all of these ideas is the practice. And I would say yes and no. Holding everything that two people who've been in deep practice for decades hold as practice is, you know, there's a scale thing there. But finding a nugget or two from what we talked about today around how you could practice differently feels much more like a appropriate on-ramp, you know? It's like, oh, perhaps when I was talking about challenging practice versus supportive and nurturing practice, and you've always thought of it as challenging, and it's like, what might nurturing practice look like for you? It's like, if that really sparked something or really hit, it's like, follow that, you know? Yeah, but I'm not seeing other.
Yep.
Oh,
I actually, yep, we have one here. I love that you just said that. And I think that that's a nice meta way of holding the conversation. So we've been in conversation about practice today.
yeah.
And yeah, have touched on a lot. So I love that you highlighted a way to actually come away from this conversation and pull something through that can be actionable and relevant to one's life. So Eric is asking, can you speak more to the deeper why? What can motivate practice? What do you have to say about that?
So because I know you, Eric, and because I'm like, I'm wondering if you're like a shill that's setting me up here. This is my favorite topic to talk about. Like, to me, a big part of my coaching approach and a big part of how I work with people is first, most of my clients are men, and a big piece of the masculine is finding your why, knowing your why. It's like, what am I here for? What's this all about? Like, and this relates to the spiritual line of development as well. It's just, how do I go about meaning making in such a way that I'm choosing to empower, enliven, and think about something bigger than myself. And so I kind of, my bias again, but I think a strong argument can be made for this. I kind of think life is a freaking waste of time if you don't know the answer to that question. And so to the extent that you know your why, to the extent that you have a reason for being and getting up in the morning, to the extent that you have a sense of purpose or calling or direction that's driving you in a positive way, like everything changes and everything gets really clear. One of my favorite quotes from the Buddha is, when I become clear, everything becomes clear, you know? And so there's this sense then of, if I'm choosing deliberate practice that I want to maintain and be in long term, my practice has to be on behalf of that deeper why. Like, there's a lot of things I would love to learn parkour as a practice. I think it's so cool. The overall value it would bring to me and my why and my purpose is low. It might bring me some inspiration or some short-term enthusiasm until I run into a wall or fall off of a parking garage. So it hasn't been prioritized. But I've been having a sitting practice for over 2 decades, and I resist doing it most every day still. And the amount of value that it brings for me to bring everything down and ground and connect to a deeper source of wisdom and source and the force, or whatever you want to call it, it's just astronaut. Like, I don't feel like I could function without it at the level that I do. And so as a why, and if I think about my why, it's like, that is helping me focus on my practice. And I would also say there's a practice, if you don't know your why, your sort of default practice is finding it.
I'm glad you said that. I was just about to say that too. Yeah.
How would you answer that though?
Yeah, I think that that having a sense of your purpose is a big part. Well, it's definitely a big part for me in the way that I coach as well. But there's also even if it's not tied specifically to purpose, the other way that I think is a nice way in is this thing called authentic truth. Right. And so even if it isn't tied to what I should be enacting or doing in the world, it's like, who am I really? What do I really want? And what's truly important to me, and how can I show up more as that in the world? You know, we are in a world where we are conditioned from the time that we are born to be different than who we really are. And so I think it's a valuable journey for anyone to begin to find what that truth is, and decondition oneself to the extent that you can actually enact what is authentically true for you in the world. So that can be, the deeper why as well. It's like, yeah, I just feel like I can't be who I really am. And so what is that about? And how might I be able to start? What does that look like? And it could even be just these asking of these questions and journaling on them, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like masculine and feminine. It's like the masculine tends to privilege purpose and direction and calling and those things, and the feminine tends to privilege more of a sense of what's the yearning of the becoming.
Right.
And it's interesting too, like when we think about our professional offerings, a lot of my coaching is around men's work and purpose and finding your why and finding a deeper contribution that actually alleviates suffering for the planet and its people. And yours is, the deepest yes, like who the hell do I want to be so that I'm not only feel my best, but being at my best is a default contribution. It has ripple effects continuously around me to help other people connect with their deepest yes. Did I get that right?
You did. Yes. I would say that your deepest yes also has a purpose component. So this is where the two, the masculine and feminine intertwine, right? Which is lovely. So we're actually a little bit over time, but before we sign off, Kevin, I want to give you a chance to actually tell the audience where they can find you, both on the, at Integral Life and outside of Integral Life.
Yeah. So if you go to Kevin Snorf, SNORF as in Frank.com, kevinsnorf.com, you can find out more about me and my offerings in the past of mixed martial arts and yoga and meditation and all the things. I do actually lead once a week yoga class for free-ish, and you can sign up for that there if you want. And then also more information about my coaching is there. I also do some I previously was a director with Integral Coaching Canada, and though I'm not doing any work for them anymore, I always plug them because they're just some of the most incredible people on the planet. So go check them out if you don't know about them and have some interest there. And I also, for professionals and people who are in leadership and are interested more in that side of things, I work with Stegan Leadership Academy outside of Dallas, Texas, as a coach, executive coach for them. And their programming is very integral based and just fantastic. It's a year-long leadership program that's deeply based in deliberate practice and really, really cool. So, yeah. And unofficially, if you're in the Bay Area, you should come join our San Francisco Star Wars meetup group because I'm a super nerd.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you also run, as you mentioned before, you run the men's group for Integral Life.
That's
on the
right.
Integral Life
Yeah.
platform,
as
well as the Enneagram. Yeah, as well as the Enneagram group. So I love that. Good.
Both of which I should say are based in how to practice in those realms, how to practice with Enneagram and how to practice. Like, getting me to not talk about practice is not going to work. You're going to have to fight me and I'm going to win.
And that's why I invited you on.
Yeah.
To be my compatriot here. So as I said, my name is Lisa Frost, and you can find me at yourdeepestestyes.com, as well as happyhealthyleaders.com. So I currently maintain two separate websites, one for the leadership side of the house and one for more of this deeper thing around authenticity and purpose. I am running the Integral Women's Group on Integral Life. And I also am running currently a series on embodying AQUIL. So if you're interested in more of the AQUIL framework and how you might be able to understand how that relates to practice and to embodiment, that's what we're covering in there. And beyond that, we're going to be doing this podcast together, which I'm excited about. We'll have guests on in the future, and we'll get into all kinds of I don't even know what to say. Comedic, I don't know. Trouble.
We're definitely going to need a beep button. We got to figure that out. How to bleep my expletives. And just a deeper plug for Integral Life too, because we were talking about this the other day with Corey and Rob, is just the sense of, where else can you find a practice group, like so many membership things these days are based in watching videos, getting more knowledge, getting more insight, and doing coaching or something, but like not being in practice. And so for those who aren't perhaps in as part of the integral life thing, join up, because there's tons of sessions and a massive backlog of stuff around how to be in practice that's so helpful. And I think that's really cool about the whole integral life approach, is they're focused on practice. So plug for that as well.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, there's something that comes online that is quite magical when you are practicing in group as opposed to practicing by yourself. So if you are an Integral Life member and you have not yet taken advantage of one of the embodiment practices,
what are you doing? Come hang out with us.
Yeah, come hang out with us. It's totally worth it. It'll be totally worth your time. At least you've got to explore it because it's one of your benefits. If you aren't a member yet, check it out, because not only will you get some of the best media on ways of actually approaching the world that help you make sense of the world, but there is this whole body of practice that's available to you as well. So enough said about all of that. I have totally enjoyed having this conversation with you, as
Me
usual.
too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for everybody who's watching and everybody who came. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Cheers all.